everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. Today we are picking back up with the 1987 mystery of the boys on the tracks, 16-year-old Don Henry and 17-year-old Kevin Ives. When we last left off, the families of these two boys believed they had finally gotten their day in court between the prosecutor's hearing, overturning the ruling of the state medical examiner, Dr. Fahmy Malik, the exhumation and second autopsies of the bodies, and the order for a grand jury to be convened. The parents of Kevin and Don felt like they were going to get some justice for their sons, whose deaths they unequivocally did not believe had happened due to an accident. So there's a lot going on in today's episode. It's going to get real juicy at times, and we're going to dive back into the case. But first, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video. I would like to thank Midas Merge for sponsoring our video today. I know that we all like to decompress at the end of a long day. We like to kind of just relax our minds, be low key. But I think a lot of the time we do that by doom scrolling, and I've been trying to get away from doom scrolling through TikTok and Instagram because I've noticed that hours passed and I've learned nothing and my brain is oatmeal. So instead, I've been trying to listen to something educational and entertaining on YouTube while I play mobile games that give my brain a challenge. And the matching and merging games are my absolute favorite because they are so satisfying. They're just challenging enough, but also relaxing and super satisfying. Well, Midas Merge is a Merge 3 game where players combine creatures and treasures strategically so they can complete quests and harness the sun's energy to dispel the darkness cast by Nyx, the goddess of night. And you get to team up with King Midas and Queen Leah to revive the Gardens of Gold, which are under the shadow of Nyx. Now, I've been playing Midas Merge at night to unwind because it is so relaxing and, like I said, satisfying. It's got a fun storyline. I'm also loving the adorable creatures that you get to hatch and evolve by merging items. My favorite is the plume squirrels. To me, they look like a cross between a squirrel and a peacock. They're all colorful and cute and pretty, but in general, the aesthetic of this game, it's just perfect. It's got bright colors, pretty visuals, combined with this relaxing, happy music. It's just such a pleasure to spend time playing Midas Merge. And when you merge the items, the sound that it makes is also very satisfying. Check it out. Yes. See, now I just want to play. The best part is Midas Merge is free to download on iOS or Android, and it's also perfect for offline playing, so you can dive into this magical world anytime, anywhere, even if you don't have Wi-Fi. So it's perfect for a long flight because playing Midas Merge is truly an escape. Plus, you get to enjoy an ad-free experience with no dead ends. And I know we've all been there with mobile games where you play for a few minutes and then you're hit with a lengthy ad you have to watch before you can continue, or you have to buy something in order to keep playing, or you have to wait a certain amount of time to get more lives. Not with Midas Merge. It is pure merging joy on your own schedule. And the new year is the perfect time to start diving into the world of Midas Merge. You can start 2025 on a high note with endless merging fun and brighten your day with cute creatures. You can start playing today and be among the first 100 to install via my link or QR code. And if you're one of the first 100, you're going to receive a unique Mox Fox Level 1. And this ultra cute creature boosts your garden's progress and will be personalized with my name, which is kind of cool. So don't miss out and download now via the QR code you see on the screen or via the link in my description box. Thank you so much to Midas Merge for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. I want to start off with a disclaimer. We're going to cover a lot in today's video, and it's one of those non-stop twisty and turny kind of situations. So get ready for that ride. We're also going to jump around a little bit in the timeline. which is very much something that I don't like to do. I'm a chronological sort of girl. It just organizes better in my head that way, and I assume that it organizes better in everybody's head that way. However, this is not a case, at least right now, in which we can stay chronological the entire time. So when I do jump around in the timeline, I will do my best to make that clear to you so that you don't get lost. I already got lost a couple of dozen times for you, and I had to literally make a timeline with a pen and paper so I could keep track of it as I was writing this. But I think I know the way by now, and hopefully I can keep you there with me. So remember the grand jury, whose purpose it was to look into the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. And this grand jury was sworn in on April 27th, 1988. And remember that Dan Harmon was the special prosecutor. And remember that Justice John Cole was the presiding judge. We already discussed how the second autopsies on Don and Kevin, performed by Dr. Joseph Burton from Atlanta, showed that both boys had been attacked. Kevin had been hit in the face with a blunt object, most likely the butt of a rifle, and Don had been stabbed in the back. Now, on May 26th, the grand jury ruled the deaths of the boys were probable homicides based on the information that they'd heard so far, but they would continue to hear testimony from witnesses for another 7 months. On September 9th, 1988, Dan Harmon made the surprising decision to reveal Dr. Burton's findings to the public, even though grand jury proceedings are supposed to be kept secret. Now, Dr. Burton had videotaped his testimony because he was not in the state of Arkansas, and in the videotape he said, quote, "To begin with, one of the things I feel is most disconcerting and very important in this case is the shirt that was worn by Don Henry, or allegedly worn by Don Henry. This is the shirt that was not on the boy's body when he was found. That was some distance away from the track, where the torso and body of Don Henry were recovered. This shirt, as you know, has a lot of tears and defects in it. A question was raised as to whether these tears or defects were made by the body being pulled down the track by the motion of the train over the body of the victim. What I did was I took the shirt to a private lab that I work with here in Atlanta, and we took one of these tears on the lower back area of the shirt that kind of was in the area where the injury was on the back of Don Henry, and we took a scalpel and we cut the defect out, which measured a little bit over 1 inch in length. We then took this defect and it was analyzed under a scanning electron microscope, which is a very powerful microscope, and with this microscope you can tell whether fabric has been torn or cut with something like scissors or a knife. The shirt in this area indeed exhibit all the characteristics of a defect caused by something with a sharp blade, such as a knife. As I said, it's a little over 1 inch in length. The markings of it are similar to the markings made by the cut of the scalpel in the fabric. There is no question that this particular defect is not a tear, and it was made by something cutting through the fabric. Also, around the marking of this defect are a number of red blood cells or objects consistent with red blood cells under the scanning electron microscope. So, not only do we have a defect in the shirt, but there is also blood around that defect. I think this is important. First of all, the shirt was not on the body when it was found, and secondly, the defect was not a tear that you might expect from the shirt snagging on a cross tie or on a railroad spike or on something underneath the train itself. It is consistent with something actually cutting the fabric," end quote. So what Burton is saying here is Don's shirt, which was not found on him, had tears in the back, and they were trying to figure out whether those tears were made when his body was hit by the train, and they're saying no, absolutely not. These tears were made by something sharp cutting through the shirt, meaning that Don had his shirt on when he was stabbed in the back. Burton also testified to an injury on Kevin Ives' left cheek, an injury he did not find consistent with what the cowcatcher of a train might cause, and so he had sent photos of the boys' injuries to the Dade County Medical Examiner's Office in Miami because they employed computer enhancement specialists there, and he said that those results hadn't come back yet, but his colleague and fellow pathologist, Dr. William Anderson, had also taken a look at the case and expressed an interest in the, quote, "degree of reaction and the congestion and fluid in the lungs of both boys," end quote. So Anderson felt that the lungs of Don and Kevin were inconsistent with injuries one would expect to see in a train accident, which would lead to sudden death. Anderson felt that this alone would strongly suggest the boys were injured, rendered unconscious, or even killed before being run over by the train. So the summary of all of this is that, without a doubt, Kevin and Don's deaths were not caused by being run over by the train. And did any of us really believe that they were to begin with? No. So Dr. Burton's testimony, however, only bolstered Linda Ives and the other parents. It let them know that they hadn't been crazy or unable to accept the loss of their sons. There was something going on here that needed to be addressed. However, Linda Ives also noticed that as the grand jury dragged on for months, attorney Dan Harmon seemed to be calling a lot of witnesses who weren't testifying about Kevin and Don. They were testifying about drugs. He was calling people like drug dealers, people who knew the drug dealers, police officers who had arrested the drug dealers or had interactions with them, but he wasn't calling anyone who seemed to have any information about Kevin or Don and how they had died. So as the grand jury was going on, a lot of other things were happening behind the scenes, as well as right out in the public. Altogether, 8 people who would be connected to this case would die or go missing, and 2 of them died as the grand jury was in session. Now, there's an important question we have to answer before we dive into this portion of the video, and that would be, what did these 8 people know? Or how were they connected to Don and Kevin? Now, the true and complete story may never be known, but over time and through witness accounts, we have a pretty good idea of what it's believed happened that night. It's believed that on the night of August 23rd, 1987, Kevin and Don were out spotlight hunting when they encountered a group of 5 individuals on the train tracks. This was around 2 a.m. Now, allegedly, amongst these 5 people was Dan Harmon. Okay? Now, reportedly, Don and Kevin stumbled upon a drug drop that night. A large amount of cocaine was dropped along the tracks by a low-flying plane with the intention of Dan Harmon and other public officials, including law enforcement, to collect these drugs and then, do whatever they were going to do with them, distribute them, sell them, whatever. Now, at the train tracks between the 2 boys, Kevin and Don, and Dan Harmon and his cronies, there was apparently a confrontation of sorts. There was a shot fired, maybe from Don Henry's rifle, and then Don and Kevin ran away. Not long after this, the boys ran into a man who was not much older than them. This man was named Keith Coney, and Keith knew Don and Kevin. They didn't, hang in the same circles or anything. They just happened to know each other, and Keith was on his motorcycle. So Keith stopped. He started talking to Kevin and Kevin and Don told Keith about what had just happened on the train tracks. And as they walked, all 3 of them together, 2 off-duty police officers from neighboring Pulaski County apprehended them. Allegedly, these 2 men were Sergeant J. Campbell and Kirk Lane, who was an undercover detective for the narcotics division of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office at that time. Reportedly and allegedly, the 2 men pulled up in an unmarked police vehicle. They detained Kevin and Don while Keith jumped back on his motorcycle and sped away. It's believed that one of these men, most likely Jay Campbell, struck Kevin in the head with the butt of his .22 rifle, rendering him unconscious. Allegedly at that time, Kevin and Don were then placed into the vehicle and driven back to the train tracks where they all met up with Dan Harmon and the others. Now, it's believed that Kevin had possibly died from his head wound, and so they decided to kill Don by stabbing him to death because he knew too much and he'd seen their faces. Once the boys were dead, their bodies were placed on the train tracks and covered with a tarp. And the assailants, including Dan Harmon, they knew the train would be coming, and the tarp covering the bodies was put there intentionally because they figured if these bodies were covered up completely by the tarp, then the bodies of the boys wouldn't catch the eyes of the train crew, and then the boys would be run over and everyone would think it was just an accident. Unfortunately for the bad guys, the tarp partially blew away, revealing Kevin and Don's upper bodies, which did catch the eyes of the train crew, enough so that they would be able to testify very confidently that the 2 boys had not moved a muscle as that train approached. Now, in May of 1988, just a few weeks after the grand jury convened, Keith Coney, remember it's the dude that Kevin and Don saw on his motorcycle that night, he seemed to be getting nervous, and he told his family that he knew that 2 law enforcement officials were responsible for Kevin and Don's murders. On May 17th, 2 days after revealing this information, Keith was killed in a motorcycle crash as he was being chased by unknown individuals.
He was killed when his motorcycle crashed while he was being chased. According to some officers, his throat had previously been slashed, and he was apparently fleeing his attackers when he lost control. However, This crucial information was left out of the final report. There was no autopsy or investigation.
And I don't think it was an accident because he was fearing for his life, a couple of months before. He said a couple of times that he knew that he was being watched and he was afraid.
Mrs. Alexander says her son knew the two teenagers run over by the train, and she says he indicated to her he had been there when the boys had died, that he spotted two attackers.
But he knew there was two there. I did try to get him to tell me who, and he was either afraid or didn't know.
On October 12th of 1988, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired about the Boys on the Tracks case. And as Unsolved Mysteries does, they asked for witnesses who had potentially seen anything or knew anything about Don and Kevin, and they asked these witnesses to come forward, and the witnesses were asked to do this by contacting a tip line set up by Richard Garrett, who was an attorney, and the Saline County Sheriff's Office. Now, it's believed that this broadcast and the tip line unintentionally or intentionally exposed witnesses who had real and viable information, and this exposed the witnesses to the very people who didn't want that information to get out, aka Richard Garrett, Dan Harmon, and some other public officials, including politicians and law enforcement. So a redacted FBI file from a 1993 investigation, which we're going to talk about in more depth in a minute, it states that witnesses who called into Garrett's tip line were threatened and told to keep quiet about what they knew. And in the following 6 months, 5 more people would be taken out of the equation. Keith McCaskill, who allegedly was with Dan Harmon on the tracks the night they encountered Kevin and Don, he had an interview with Richard Garrett, but within days of that interview, Keith seemed to know he had made a mistake. He had talked to the wrong people, and so he told his family and his friends goodbye, and he made his own funeral arrangements. Now, Keith McCaskill, according to Dan Harmon, when he was talking to Linda Ives, he was a skilled photographer, and Keith had taken some aerial photos of the area where the boys had died. But Keith was also the manager of this place called the Wagon Wheel. It was a private club right on the edge of Saline County. And it's kind of like on the edge of Saline County, but located in Pulaski County, because at that time, Saline County was dry. You couldn't drink alcohol there. So when the residents of Saline County wanted a drink, they would head to the Wagon Wheel. Now, Dan Harmon told Linda Ives that through his connections at the club, where everyone from law enforcement to the criminal element would congregate, McCaskill was acting as an informant, and he'd promised to pass along any information he'd heard regarding Kevin and Don. Now, of course, Dan Harmon did not tell Linda Ives about Keith's alleged participation in the murder of her son and his best friend. Kathy Carty, one of the first responders to the scene of the train incident, was actually pretty tight with Keith McCaskill, even though she knew he was a drug user. Before becoming a cop, Kathy had worked at a liquor store right next to the Wagon Wheel, and she said Keith had protected her and kept her safe, and they developed a pretty tight friendship over the years, which continued even after Kathy joined law enforcement. Kathy Carty would later say, quote, "Maybe it's not exactly the way things ought to be done, but Keith gave me a lot of good information on things I was investigating, and in exchange for that, I turned a blind eye to some things I might not have approved of," end quote. It seems like a lot of people in this area of Arkansas, a lot of law enforcement, turn blind eyes to a lot of things, and we're going to kind of get into that. Not only do they turn a blind eye, but they might actually be actively participating in these illegal activities. And when I say they might actually be, I mean they definitely were. So when the grand jury began, Kathy Carty was told by Keith McCaskill that she should, quote, "watch Dan Harmon," because he was one of the county's biggest drug suppliers. And neither Keith nor Kathy had any solid evidence of this, so Kathy said she kept the information quiet. She kind of kept it in the back of her mind. She was unable to do anything with it. But then on November 10th, 1988, Kathy Carty was at work at the sheriff's office when Sheriff James Steed came in and announced that Keith McCaskill had gotten himself killed. McCaskill had been stabbed 113 times, and his body was found wrapped in a flowered patterned shower curtain in the garage of his Benton, Arkansas home. Now, when Dan Harmon informed Linda Ives about the death of his prized informant, he told her that Keith had been found wrapped in a tarp, and it was, quote, "a message to us all, so we'll connect it and back off," end quote. I wouldn't say that a flower patterned shower curtain is the same as a missing green tarp, but obviously Dan Harmon is trying to make Linda Ives feel scared, like they're either on the right track because they're getting close and the heat's getting on them, or, they're venturing into territory where none of them might be safe. So Keith McCaskill's murder was never solved, but his death came within days of him saying his goodbyes and making his own funeral arrangements, and within a week of his own interview with Richard Garrett, Dan Harmon's business partner and friend.
The night of elections in 1988, he took 2 pennies out of his pocket and threw them on the bar there at the Wagon Wheel and said, "If Jim Steed loses this election, my life isn't worth 2 cents." And he was murdered that night.
Harmon, Garrett, and members of the Arkansas police suddenly found themselves in the awkward position of having to try and convince the public that the deaths of these key witnesses, coming at a crucial point in the investigations, were merely a coincidence.
I think that Mr. McCaskill was probably suffering from a lot of paranoia. And right now the indications are that nobody else was involved.
Might there have been a reason, though, for his paranoia?
I'm sure there was a reason for his paranoia.
Because he had talked to the police or the prosecutor?
I don't know that would be the reason.
What about the murder? Is it connected at all with the grand jury investigation?
Not that we know of.
McCaskill was a witness in the Bryant train deaths investigation. Although police haven't ascertained a motive for the murder, they say there's no connection.
Link this investigation to the deaths of Don Henry or Kevin Ives. And I don't foresee anything in the pursuance of the rest of this investigation that would be anything that would make me change my mind.
So you heard about an election mentioned in that clip, and they were referring to the 1988 sheriff's election, which was between the current sheriff, James Steed, and then Republican candidate Larry Davis, who had been publicly supported by Linda Ives. See, Linda was already pissed at James Steed. She'd already had words with him. She'd already publicly called him out more than once. The grand jury proceedings were not helping that relationship grow warmer because as the months went on, Judge John Cole was getting impatient with the grand jury. He claimed it was taking too long and it was costing too much money. And Sheriff Steed had been asked to give some money that was allocated to his drug task force to fund the grand jury. And he flat out refused, saying, quote, "They are not getting it. I am not financing the grand jury with my drug money." It's a weird way of putting it. My drug money. We're going to find that's a little prophetic, but he continues on and says, "And I don't know a nice way of saying that," end quote. This enraged Linda Ives, but she became even more furious when she learned that despite his promise to send Don and Kevin's clothes to the FBI, James Steed had instead sent them to the Arkansas State Crime Lab in Little Rock, where, as we know now, these clothes were never even examined. So basically, Linda Ives, she's pissed. She goes into James Steed's office, and she gave him an earful. And then she told him he was in deep shit. And reportedly, Sheriff Steed looked at Linda and said, quote, "Lady, I don't care," end quote. He really doesn't know nice ways to say things, does he? It's absolutely true. So after that, Linda Ives publicly endorsed Sheriff Steed's opponent, Larry Davis, for, the sheriff's race. And during a press conference, Linda announced, quote, "While I feel that politics should not play a role in any murder investigation, I feel it has been a major stumbling block in the investigation of my son's murder. I'm here because I am tired of the political games and deals that are played and made in the Saline County Sheriff's Office. I greatly resent the way the Sheriff's Office has handled the whole investigation," end quote. And she was like, vote for Larry Davis. Don't vote for James Steed. And not only is all of this playing out in the press, but the comment about not caring that James Steed had made to Linda, she reported that to some publications, and that quote ended up in some articles, and the public was not happy at all with this dismissive attitude that Sheriff Steed had shown towards a grieving mother whom they believed had every right to be fed up and upset and frustrated. So Larry Davis ended up winning the sheriff's race 58 to 42%, and then, as Keith McCaskill had predicted, his life was no longer worth the risk he posed, and he was murdered. After several months, the grand jury into Kevin and Don's deaths ended suddenly on December 31st, 1988.
The 8-month-long grand jury investigation into Kevin and Don's murder came to an abrupt halt December 31st, 1988. Last-minute legal maneuvering by Harmon, Garrett, and presiding judge John Cole prevented the jurors from revealing their findings in the final report. The men and women of the grand jury were sent home frustrated that they had not been allowed to do their job.
The Saline County Special Grand Jury has now disbanded. 3 hours ago, it delivered its final report on the deaths of 2 teenage boys. But the grand jury was not allowed to do what it wanted.
I know that because you could not repeat in the report much of the testimony that you heard and evidence that you received, that you are somewhat frustrated by it. And that's understandable.
In the final analysis, I know that the grand jury hated at this point to give it up, because I think the public needs to know about the seriousness of the drug problem here in Saline County and maybe other surrounding counties.
The jury had been working on this for almost a year. They had given the case a lot of their time and energy, and they'd become invested, especially after hearing testimony about how rampant drug activity was in that area of Arkansas. And when I say drugs, I don't mean marijuana. I know we've talked a lot about weed and Kevin and Don smoking weed and them going to buy weed. I'm not talking about marijuana. I mean the harder stuff, okay? Usually in this case, cocaine. And the jury had actually prepared a 5-page report that included a 200-page attachment which contained the testimony of our bestie, Dr. Fahmy Malik. And to everyone's surprise, Judge Cole ordered that neither of these things should be released, and instead he allowed the jury to release a 1.5-page, heavily redacted, heavily edited version of their conclusions. And this synopsis simply stated that the deaths of Don and Kevin were probably drug-related and that they weren't accidents, they had been murdered, but there was no indictments or charges handed down as a result of this very lengthy grand jury proceeding. Judge Cole said that because of state law, which barred the release of grand jury testimony without the permission of the witness, Malik's testimony would not be revealed because he had not given his permission. Malik is so... Oh, he's infuriating because he's like, I'll stake my job on this. If anybody can come out and prove that these kids died as a result of anything other than, smoking too much Mary Jane and then falling asleep on the railroad tracks, I will stake my job on it. And when he's got, actual people and experts in front of him who are like, yeah, actually, Don Henry had a stab wound. And Kevin was hit in the face and the head with the butt of a rifle. How did you miss this, you moron? He's all crickets and quiet. And he doesn't want the public now to see his words in the testimony that he gave during that grand jury, which, he's a coward. Are we that surprised? I'm not surprised. So at that point, the grand jury's called to convene, and then they are called to disband, and everyone was supposed to go home and just be happy with what they had accomplished in that 9 months, which in my opinion was all of nothing, right? So the grand jury was over, but the elimination of witnesses was not. On January 22nd, 1989, 26-year-old Greg Collins was found dead in a forest from 3 shotgun blasts fired at close range. And Collins had actually been subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury in Saline County, but he'd never shown up. I wonder why. There was a smattering of reports that Collins had privately and off the record spoken to Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett about Kevin and Don, and there was a rumor that he'd been with the boys on the night they died. But it was also well known that Greg Collins was friends with Keith Coney, who, remember, Keith Coney is the young man on the motorcycle who allegedly and reportedly saw Kevin and Don the night of their murders, and he also ended up dead after being chased on his motorcycle. So as it turns out, Collins' murder was also never solved. And on top of that, Booney Bearden, another witness who was supposed to testify before the grand jury, he'd been missing for several months, and a search began for him in March of 1989.
Booney Bearden, a friend of both Coney and Collins, disappeared. An article of Bearden's clothing was found in the vicinity where an anonymous caller claimed his murder had taken place. His body was never recovered.
In April, it was revealed that another man had been reported missing, 21-year-old Jeffrey Edward Rhodes, who was known to be connected to the drug scene in Arkansas and who had reportedly told members of his family that he knew too much about the murders of Kevin, Don, and Keith McCaskill. His body would be found a week later.
After telling his family he knew too much about Kevin, Don, and McCaskill's murders, Rhodes had been shot in the head and his remains set on fire in a dump.
Jeffrey's father, Eddie Rhodes, told a reporter from the Arkansas Democrat that his son had called him 2 months before he died and said that he needed to get out of Benton. He wanted to go to Texas, where Eddie lived, and, see if there was anything there for him because he had to get out of Arkansas. And Eddie Rhodes said, quote, "He wanted to know if I could get him a job here in Houston. I asked him why. He said he had to get out of Benton, that he knew something about the Keith McCaskill murder." End quote. Eddie Rhodes went on to report that he'd actually contacted law enforcement in Benton, and he told them this. And they seemed to be taking him seriously, but the Saline County Sheriff's Office, quote, dismissed the whole idea. The sheriff investigator said that everybody wanted to connect everything that happened in Saline County to either that case of the 2 boys who were left on the railroad tracks or to drugs. They never did a thing about it, end quote. Now, while the sheriff's office, which was now led by Larry Davis, was denying every other week that these deaths and disappearances were not connected at all to Kevin Ives and Don Henry, Frank Pilcher of Pulaski County was charged with the murder of Jeffrey Rhodes. Now, during Pilcher's trial, his girlfriend, Melissa Bragg, testified that she'd witnessed the murder and she'd help him get rid of the body. She also said that Rhodes had been working for a Benton hairdresser named Ron Kettleson, who was also apparently a huge dealer of cocaine in the area. And Marissa had actually gone to Kettleson's business one day to get her hair done with her friend Deanne Parker, who also happened to be the same woman who had discovered the body of Keith McCaskill. So a lot of people are connected here. And someone had also been arrested in the death of Keith McCaskill. He was a young man named Shane Smith, who a psychologist had described as being socially withdrawn, emotionally immature, and of below average intelligence. And during Smith's trial, we got to hang out with our bestie, Dr. Fahmy Malek again, who, remember, was still working and still flourishing despite the fact that no one trusted his ass at all. The state had 2 important witnesses against Shane Smith. One was an Arkansas State Police investigator named Dan Birdsong, and the other was Dr. Fahmy Malek, which caused actually one prospective juror to withdraw. He was like, I don't even want to be involved. When they're questioning prospective jurors to see if they're good to be put on the actual sitting jury, this guy was like, I don't want to be on the jury because I cannot accept this medical examiner as a credible witness. Same, my dude, same. So Smith's defense team threw everything at the case, attempting to discredit Malek on the stand using the many, many claims of incompetence and altering evidence that had already been levied against Dr. Malek. But when the state objected to this line of questioning, the judge sustained their objections. And do you know who the judge in this trial was? Judge John Cole. All right, remember that. Judge John Cole, he's going to pop up again. He's been the judge in the prosecutor's hearing. He's been the judge in the grand jury for Kevin and Don, and he seems to be everywhere. He seems to be calling the shots everywhere. So the defense even brought forth a witness who was willing to testify to being offered money to kill McCaskill. And Judge Cole claimed that the testimony would be inadmissible. Judge Cole also heard from another man, David Hart. This was a former police officer from Pulaski County, and Hart had actually spoken to Keith McCaskill before he died, and Keith had claimed he was being followed by a bunch of men in a car. He was afraid for his life because he knew something about the railroad track thing, Keith McCaskill called it. And at that point, I guess Judge Cole ran out of patience, and he ruled that there would be no testimony allowed that would speak to Keith McCaskill fearing for his life. That's kind of an arbitrary call, don't you think? Even though the defense was able to prove that a hair found in McCaskill's clenched fist did not match Shane Smith, and Shane Smith was not a match for a bloody handprint found on the wall inside McCaskill's house, the jury still found Smith guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. If they really believed that he stabbed Keith McCaskill over 100 times, why was he found guilty of second-degree murder, and why was he only given 10 years in prison? You stabbed somebody over 100 times, and I think that's worthy of more than 10 years in prison, but whatever. Then, in July of 1989, another grand jury witness named Richard Winters was gunned down during an attempted robbery of a crap game in Lanoke County, which is northeast of Little Rock. We're going to come back to Richard Winters and to this robbery, but in order to do that, we have to go forward in the timeline a little bit to April of 1990. Now, at that time, Gene Duffy was a deputy prosecuting attorney in the 7th Judicial District of Arkansas, which covered the counties of Saline, Hot Spring, and Grant. And she was in charge of drunk driving cases. She was doing a great job. Within her first year, Duffy had moved Saline County's DWI conviction rate from 68% to 98%. She was known to be a young up-and-comer with the right energy for the job, a woman who didn't back down, and she went after the bad guys, no matter what they looked like or who they knew and who they could call favors in from, even if they wore a badge. Even if they were a public official, Gene Duffy was not scared. She would go after them. As we've already touched on, there appeared to be a huge problem with drugs in Arkansas, and in April of 1990, federal funds became available to form a drug task force, and Gene Duffy was made its director by her then boss, Gary Arnold, who was the prosecuting attorney in the district at that time. Gene Duffy would later say, quote, "When I was hired, Gary Arnold looked at me sternly and said, 'You are not to use this drug task force to investigate any public officials.'" End quote. Now, earlier that year, Dan Harmon had decided to run for prosecuting attorney, and between his work on the Saline Memorial Hospital scandal, as well as the Boys on the Tracks case, it seemed he probably would have it in the bag. Now, I want to give you a little background on Dan Harmon, because even though he wore the mask of a respected public official who was hard on drugs and hard on crime, underneath the facade, Dan Harmon, he was a criminal. He had some issues, okay? And he didn't have a great start either. So a lot of people gave him a pass for this. They gave him an excuse for sort of being rough around the edges and maybe doing things in an unorthodox manner. When he was just a baby, Harmon's mother had passed away, and his father had taken off, leaving Dan to be raised by his grandparents. And when Harmon was 12 years old, his grandfather died, and so the young boy decided to step up and get a job so he could help his grieving grandmother make ends meet. He grew up poor. He grew up rough around the edges, but he was scrappy. And even though he didn't have any money, he always found a way to get money for the things that he really wanted. So in high school, Harmon played tight end on the Benton football team, and a former teammate remembered that Harmon didn't have money to go to prom, so he made a bet with his friends on the team. And the bet was that he could run 10 miles from the old high school, the old Benton High School, to the new one. And he had his teammates collectively throw in about $100, betting that he could not do this. And so the teammate who was talking about Dan Harmon and this bet said, quote, "Danny set out running, and we were following behind in cars, honking and urging him on. He ran like crazy, and he made it. That's just how Danny was." End quote. After high school, Dan Harmon attended Arkansas Tech for a year on a football scholarship, but he left school for a little while to enlist in the Army before enrolling at the University of Arkansas, where he graduated from law school. In the 1970s, Harmon was elected as prosecuting attorney for the 7th District, but when he ran unopposed for a second term, he suddenly and out of nowhere dropped out of the race. He didn't give anybody a reason for this, and he left nobody to fill the position. Because remember, he had already been the prosecuting attorney for a term. Everybody thought he was doing a fine job. Nobody tried to run against him. And so when he just left and didn't tell anybody where he was going, there was nobody there to actually do that job. And after this, Dan Harmon filed for bankruptcy. He claimed he had $125,000 in debt and that he was only making $30,000 a year. And then he just dropped off the map for 4 months. When he returned to Arkansas, Dan Harmon claimed he'd been in California, and then he just went back to Arkansas and returned to practicing law and didn't really say anything about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. But not only did Dan Harmon seemed professionally scattered, but his personal life was also kind of a mess. Harmon had been married and divorced twice before he met Teresa. This was a woman in her 20s who was friends with one of Dan Harmon's adult daughters. And this marriage, unsurprisingly, was short-lived, but it lasted long enough for Teresa to give birth to Dan Harmon's first son during the summer of 1988. So keep in mind that Harmon has a couple older children from his first marriages, and one of those children was an adult daughter named Tammy. And then he had a very young son with his third wife, Teresa. So let's go back to Gene Duffy, who soon after becoming the head of the drug task force began linking many public officials to drug activity in Saline and surrounding counties. And one of these public officials was Surprise, surprise, Dan Harmon. So Gene turned this evidence over to the Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Govar, who at that time was heading a federal grand jury that was investigating public official corruption in that area of Arkansas. Now, just for anyone who doesn't know, Assistant U.S. Attorneys are often called federal prosecutors. They're government lawyers who act as prosecutors in federal criminal trials. So Dan Harmon, he had been the prosecuting attorney in the 7th Judicial District of Arkansas, and he was going to run for that position again in 1989. And this would be more akin to a district attorney. They both refer to the legal representative of the state in criminal proceedings. So where Govar was like a federal lawyer for the government, Dan Harmon would have been a lawyer for the state. And when Harmon was running for prosecuting attorney in 1989, he really did so based on a strong anti-drug platform, which is probably why he convinced Judge John Cole to allow him to make a public statement in the midst of the grand jury that he was heading, which was looking into the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry. Because remember, grand jury proceedings are private, and usually while they're going on, you're not talking about it. Sometimes they'll talk about it afterwards, or they'll give you a little indication of what went down or what the grand jury decided, but Dan Harmon really wanted everyone to know, while he was running for prosecuting attorney, how seriously he was taking this. Not only the tragic loss of these young men, but the drugs and the depravity that had seemingly invaded their small, tight-knit communities. So in July of 1988, during the grand jury, Dan Harmon solemnly announced, quote, "When we get to the bottom of these deaths, we believe they will somehow be drug-related. That is the one consistent thing in all the testimony we have heard, even in the rumors. So we are investigating drug trafficking in that area. We are still investigating the deaths. If we find something else when we turn over a rock, we will deal with it. We know that, from the people we are talking to, it's not obvious to the media or the public where we are going, but I feel without a doubt we will eventually get to the true story. I know some folks would like this investigating to end right here, but we're going to stick with it. The cost of the county has been relatively small, and I think the grand jury will do a lot of good exposing drug trafficking, if not solving a murder," end quote. So this is interesting because Linda Ives and the other parents had obviously been talking to Dan Harmon about what was happening during the grand jury proceedings, and he would tell them about, different witnesses he was calling up. And Linda Ives would be like, "Well, why are you calling this person? Like, what do they have to do with Kevin and Don?" And he'd be like, "Oh, no, they don't have anything to do with Kevin and Don. They have to do with like this drug thing." And she'd be like, "But why are we going that route when we're trying to find what happened to Kevin and Don?" And he'd be like, "Don't worry about it. Like, this is all going to come together. You're going to understand it all after everything is said and done. The pieces are falling into place. This is just what we have to do. We have to talk to these people." Even people in the public were like, it's weird that they're calling these witnesses. They're calling like law enforcement from different counties, and they're calling, drug dealers. And there was arrests being made of drug dealers while the grand jury was in session, people who had testified in front of the grand jury. It was very odd because it didn't seem like anything was really happening as far as Kevin and Don's case. And as we know, the grand jury didn't come up with any answers, honestly, besides to tell us what we already knew, which is that Dr. Fahmy Malek was an absolute clown man, and Kevin and Don had not died accidentally underneath a train. They'd been murdered. It seemed that these proceedings were bringing all sorts of people out of the woodwork, and arrests of high-profile members of the drug trade began happening early on in the grand jury process. Now, from this point on in the video, I'm going to be throwing a lot of names at you. It might get confusing, but all of these people are important, and I'll try to keep it all straight for you and for me, to be honest, but there's a lot of people we're going to talk about. And one of the first people who was arrested when the grand jury just started to be in session was Tommy Lee Madison. And we have heard this name already because remember, Madison was one of the men that EMT Shirley Raper had run into while she was driving through the woods trying to get to the train tracks where Kevin and Don's bodies waited. Now, Madison had told Shirley that he was a volunteer firefighter, but he wasn't, right? No surprise there. Madison, however, apparently was a drug dealer, and he was charged with 8 counts of distributing cocaine. Then, a man named Ken Cook was arrested, and he was charged with 3 counts of delivering cocaine to Tommy Lee Madison. After that, a man named Richard Sampley was arrested on the charge of aggravated robbery. Now, Harmon said that these arrests had stemmed from information garnered during Kevin and Don's Don's grand jury. But Harmon also said the arrest of these 3 men had nothing to do with the Boys on the Tracks case. These 3 men did have something or someone in common, however, and that was a man named James Callaway. From the outside, James Callaway was the owner of a used car lot in Benton called Callaway Motors, but he also seemed to be a major player in the Arkansas drug game. And this brings us back to Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Govar, who had received information from Gene Duffy in April of 1990 about certain public officials, including Dan Harmon, who also seemed to be major players in that drug game. On February 13, 1990, Bob Govar sent a memo to his boss, U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks. The memo was an informal status report pertaining to the Saline County investigation into public officials and drug trafficking that Govar had been assigned to start looking into 9 months prior. Although there wasn't a lot of funding for this investigation, it appeared that through interviews and good old-fashioned police work, Govar had already discovered and compiled quite a bit of information and evidence. Now, in this memo, Govar tells Banks that at the time that he was writing the memo, they'd already interviewed 22 witnesses in connection with the investigation, and he lists these 22 names, some of which we've already heard, such as Tommy Madison and Richard Sampley, along with 20 other names who, trust me, we're going to become familiar with. Govar said that 7 of these witnesses, including Madison and Sampley, had already been immunized, and that means they had agreed to testify and give information in exchange for immunity. Govar goes on to say that they'd already indicted one individual, and this was James Callaway. He said, quote, "We indicted Callaway on this federal offense because he purchased a sawed-off shotgun which was used in the robbery of a crap game in Lenoke County on July 20th, 1989. A man by the name of Richard Winters was one of the robbers and was shot to death during the course of the robbery. The reason we indicted this case federally is because we have information that Callaway headed a significant cocaine distribution operation in Saline County during 1987 and 1988, end quote. Richard Winters, remember, is also a name we've heard before. He was one of the witnesses called before the grand jury into Kevin and Don's death, and he was killed during a robbery. But there had been rumors that he'd been intentionally killed during that robbery to keep him quiet about what he knew about Kevin and Don's deaths and what information he had on some high-up public officials. Govar writes, quote, Richard Winters was supposedly shot to death by the person running the crap game, Sylvania Peaks. Witnesses who support the allegations that James Callaway planned the robbery and provided the shotgun that was used in the robbery are Mike Samples, Carl Samples, Bernice Samples, Joanne Winters, and Everett Vanderburg. Everett Vanderburg has given a tape-recorded statement that he sold James Callaway the sawed-off shotgun that was used in the robbery the same night as the robbery. Vanderburg stated that he had purchased the sawed-off shotgun from another individual identified as Richard Smith. Richard Smith apparently told a friend of Callaway's by the name of Vince Criswell that Vanderburg had purchased the gun and had it. According to Vanderburg, on the night of the robbery, 3 men came to his home. These 3 men were James Callaway, Tony Mullins, and Carl Samples, end quote. As a quick aside, the names of the people in this case sometimes make me feel like I'm watching some eccentric soap opera unfold. We've got Everett Vanderburg, Vince Creswell, Joanne Winters, Sylvania Peaks. So the list of these kind of strange names, these almost dramatic names, it goes on and on. Anyways, after the robbery of the crap game, Callaway gave the shotgun to Mullins. Mullins gave it to Samples, and then Samples gave it to law enforcement. In December of 1989, Samples led police to the area. The gun had been disposed of along Interstate 30, which ran east and west from Little Rock to Memphis. And Carl Samples had also worked for Callaway doing some odd jobs at his car lot, and Samples had told the grand jury under oath that he'd witnessed a Mexican man arrive to the car lot along with attorney Richard Garrett, and they delivered James Callaway boxes full of white powder that Samples believed to be cocaine. I'm sure it was. Now, this Mexican man was later found shot to death in White County, and he had been held at the state crime lab under the name John Doe. Now, Bob Govar talked about interviewing a man named Woodrow Mays, or Woody Mays, on February 12, 1990, and Mays talked about several drug dealers in Saline County, including James Callaway, who he had bought weed from on more than one occasion. 2 other witnesses also implicated Callaway. These people were Tommy Madison, the man who wasn't a firefighter, the fake firefighter. He gave a written statement on January 30th, 1990, and his statement claimed that during 1987 and 1988, he was buying cocaine in order to help out a friend. It's always for a friend, isn't it? You're never buying cocaine for yourself. You're doing it for a friend. Madison identified several sources where he was getting these drugs from, including Russell Settlers, Gary Pullian, and Kent Cook. And then Kent Cook introduced Tommy Madison to James Callaway, who Madison would purchase cocaine from on many occasions. Richard Sampley also named Callaway as a major drug player, and he had some inside knowledge because he'd actually known James Callaway for 6 years, and he'd lived with him on and off during that period. And when he lived with him, he would sometimes work for him testing cocaine at Callaway's kitchen table. Sampley said that in 1987, he had sold at least 10 ounces of cocaine for James Callaway, and he also said that during the 1987 Oak Lawn race season, he had drove with Callaway to Hot Springs to watch the horse races. They drove there in Callaway's black Marquis, and along for the ride, according to Sampley, were two people that we have come to know well, Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett. The very two same men who were allegedly helping the families of Don Henry and Kevin Ives get to the bottom of their deaths, which these two men had stated publicly were certainly drug-related. Right? So Sampley testified that during the drive, Callaway pulled out a half a gram of cocaine that he handed to Richard Garrett. Richard Garrett snorted some of it before handing the paper with the cocaine on it to Dan Harmon, who also used some of it before handing it to Richard Sampley, who finished it off. Sampley also testified that while he was living with Callaway, Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett visited on more than one occasion. The three men would always go into Callaway's bedroom and close the door so they could talk, and although Sampley didn't know what they were talking about, he did know that James Callaway kept his cocaine stash in his bedroom closet, and he also knew that Callaway did the majority of his drug dealing from that very same bedroom. Sampley also had information about the deceased Mexican man, who he said went by the name of Carlo. He had also seen Carlo exit Richard Garrett's car at the car lot, the used car lot owned by James Callaway, and this Mexican man, Carlo, would carry a briefcase into the used car lot before returning to Garrett's car, and then they would drive off. Next in the memo, Govar talks about a man named W.E. Ross, who Govar intended to seek an indictment against the following week on February 20th. So Govar said that Ross had been arrested by Saline County investigators on May 6th, 1988, at which time he was found to be in possession of 240 marijuana plants, as well as machinery and equipment that would be needed to grow and manufacture those plants. Now, Govar thought several things about Ross's arrest were fishy, as he put it. The investigation into Ross, along with the search of his premises, had all been legal and done correctly, and Ross had readily confessed to growing the marijuana with the intent and purpose to distribute it and sell it. So Govar was confused why Ross's case had been dismissed 6 months after his arrest, without any charges, right? But I'm not confused about the reason why, based on who was involved with dismissing his charges. Richard Garrett, who'd been a deputy prosecuting attorney in Saline County at that time, had prosecuted the case, and the order to dismiss had been requested by Richard Garrett and signed by none other than Circuit Judge John Cole. Govar writes, quote, "I interviewed the investigator who made this case, Saline County investigator Leonard Lewis, and he told me that he was not informed the case was dismissed, nor was he told any reason why the case was dismissed. He told me that he did not have any conversation with Richard Garrett concerning this case, and that he only knew the case had been dismissed after I called him and asked him about it, and he told me he wondered what had happened to it. Incidentally, we have narcotics intelligence information from the state police that indicates W.E. Ross moved from Saline County to Perry County, and that he is currently engaging in a marijuana growing operation with his son, W.E. Ross II, end quote. So basically what Govar is saying is, why was this guy's charges dismissed? He's caught with all of these marijuana plants. He's got machinery and equipment that you need to grow and then, make the plants into actually marijuana that can be sold. There's things you have to do there. And he confessed when he was questioned. He was like, yep, I was growing this marijuana and I was planning to sell it. But then the charges were dismissed. There was absolutely no reason why. This guy wasn't claiming to be innocent. He wasn't claiming to be set up. He didn't claim that anything had been done during the search and seizure of his home. Why would the charges be dismissed? Well, that's because Richard Garrett and John Cole the judge were in on this whole thing. And they're going to basically sweep things under the rug and, like Kathy Carty said, look the other way. But wait, there's more. Because Bob Govar talks about another person, John Rowland, who was caught literally in the act of growing marijuana in Saline County. And when I say in the act, I mean this dude was on his knees in his marijuana plant field as the cops approached him, and he was pulling up all these plants with the intention of getting rid of them, so that nobody would find out he was doing it. And Govar writes that it has occurred to him that John Rowland may have had a heads up that the police were coming, because some of Rowland's neighbors told police that he'd asked for their help pulling the plants up because the cops were on their way. Govar said, quote, Rowland was arrested on a Monday, and on the previous Friday, Saline County drug investigators had made an application for a search warrant on the land where the marijuana was growing through Judge Pete Lancaster. From what I had been told by the investigators, Judge Lancaster lives in the same area where Rowland was growing his marijuana. End quote. Very interesting, right? Very interesting. So what Govar is saying here is this dude's arrested on a Monday, but the application for the search warrant was given to a judge the previous Friday. So somebody who had knowledge that this guy's marijuana field was about to be raided let him know over the course of those 2 days, the cops are coming, get rid of them, right? Govar wrote that during the investigation, they had determined there were 2 significant drug trafficking operations in Saline and Garland counties. And he said, quote, during this point of the investigation, Dan Harmon, an attorney from Benton, Arkansas, has been identified as a target in this investigation. Dan Harmon has served in the past as the special prosecutor in charge of the Saline County Special Grand Jury, which looked into the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives, end quote. According to Bob Govar, one of his witnesses, Woody Mays, who we've already talked about. Woody Mays talked about a man named Martin Stiegel, who'd previously been identified as a large drug trafficker in Garland and Saline counties. Mays said that Stiegel would meet a connect, a person who flew cocaine into Arkansas from Texas, and they would meet every week at the Little Rock Airport before going to a second location, like a nearby Waffle House, and there they would exchange the drugs for money. Woody Mays said that Stiegel ran a business hanging ceilings, which was probably a front for the drug operation because Stiegel was in his 30s, he was young, but he was very wealthy, and he owned a lot of property, and he said this property was not apparent, like maybe the property wasn't necessarily under his name or he was hiding it under different business names, things like that, but not something a legitimate citizen would do who had nothing to hide. Woody Mays also said that several people sold drugs for Stiegel, someone named Carlo Hibbard. We've already talked about Carlo, the Mexican man that multiple people saw with Richard Garrett at James Callaway's used car lot, bringing boxes of cocaine and leaving with briefcases of money, right? There was also a guy named Mark Bubba Ray and a woman named Tammy Harmon, who, yes, you guessed it, was Dan Harmon's adult daughter. Quote, Mays stated that Marvin Stiegel is a major source of drugs in Saline County, and that if Marvin Stiegel is busted, it will probably eliminate the major source of drugs in that county. Mays stated that he never got busted the entire time that he was selling drugs in Saline County because either Tammy Harmon or Carlo Hibbard would tell him, Dan says you're getting hot. He stated that he was warned by Dan Harmon through Tammy Harmon or Carlo Hibbard at least 4 or 5 times, end quote. Mays also stated that he'd been to Dan Harmon's home several times, even when Dan had lived in the Summerwood apartments, and then later when he moved into a house with his new wife, Tammy, and his children. Mays recalled that he was in the Harmon home on one occasion shooting up with Tammy Harmon when Dan Harmon was present and in the home. And Dan Harmon was also present on another occasion when Mays was snorting cocaine with his wife, Teresa Harmon. Now, according to Mays, Teresa Harmon purchased cocaine from him quite a bit. Govar continued on, saying, quote, other witnesses have provided information during the course of this investigation pertaining to the drug activities of Benton attorney Dan Harmon, his former wife Teresa Harmon, and Dan Harmon's daughter Tammy Harmon. During the later part of 1989, Little Rock attorney Jim Clouet provided investigators working on the Saline County investigation with information pertaining to the drug activities of Dan Harmon. Clouet, who used to practice law with Dan Harmon, stated that he met Harmon and drove around with him in Saline County on one occasion recently after Harmon had called Clouet at Clouet's office. During this meeting, Harmon told Clouet that he had acquired a hydroponic system and was going to establish a marijuana growing operation in a building with a restaurant in the top of the building. According to Clouet, Harmon stated that this would be a perfect front for a marijuana growing operation and that the growing end of the operation was the place to make money. End quote. Another witness interviewed by law enforcement in connection with this case was Myron J. Harrison, who claimed that he'd known Dan Harmon casually since 1984, but they didn't really socialize until Teresa Harmon, Dan Harmon's wife, started buying cocaine from Harrison at the end of 1987. Harrison has all the tea. Harrison had so much information, it was crazy. So he said that Teresa would introduce him to her husband, Dan Harmon, in March of 1988. And Harrison stated that in March of 1988, he had met Dan Harmon at the El Chico restaurant in Southwest Little Rock to talk to him as like an attorney and a client, because I guess that Harrison was having some domestic problems and he was looking to hire a lawyer. Harrison recalled that during that conversation, Harmon asked him, hey, how much cocaine is my wife Teresa buying? End quote. According to Harrison, Dan mentioned a growing operation to him, and then Harrison asked Dan Harmon, is it okay if I keep fronting your wife Teresa cocaine? Fronting as in giving her drugs without her giving me money in return. And Dan Harmon said, yeah, it's fine. Just don't let it get out of hand. Famous last words, right? This famous last words like, yeah, my wife, she's doing a lot of cocaine. She's not paying for it. But, just don't let that get out of hand. Like, dude, that's not the drug dealer's responsibility to not let your wife's drug problem get out of hand, okay? That's the weirdest thing, to even ask a drug dealer who kind of hopes her cocaine problem gets out of hand, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you're placing the responsibility of Teresa's drug use in the hands of the very person that stands to financially benefit from her drug use. Make it make sense. It doesn't. So Harrison also said that in May of 1988, Teresa was supposed to go and pick up some drugs from him at his place, but she couldn't make it, so she sent her husband, Dan Harmon, in her place. And when Dan Harmon came to pick up the drugs, Harrison claims that Dan talked to him about some of the testimony being given during the secret grand jury proceedings into Kevin and Don's death. Now, at that time, Harrison gave Harmon an 8-ball of cocaine for Teresa, which is a lot of cocaine, okay? It's a lot of cocaine. So according to this website, which is the Carolina Center for Recovery, an 8-ball of cocaine is 1/8 of an ounce of cocaine, or about 3.5 grams. Quite a bit of cocaine, which is, if you didn't know, a highly addictive substance. So when Dan Harmon picks up this 8-ball for Teresa, he was informed by Harrison that Teresa still owed Harrison $1,800 for previous drug purchases that she hadn't paid yet. And Dan Harmon promised Harrison that he would get him the money once he was paid for a case that he was currently working on. The next month, Dan Harmon paid Harrison with a check that was drawn from his law firm. That's super professional, but it was actually Teresa Harmon who brought Harrison the check while also picking up another 1/2 ounce of cocaine at the same time. Now, Harrison said from then on, Teresa Harmon started buying from him on a daily basis, every single day. And between June and December of 1988, she had purchased several 8-balls of cocaine, and on several occasions, she also picked up 1/4 ounces of cocaine. And in August, Teresa got 2 ounces from Harrison, both of which she allegedly sold. And during that same time period, Harmon met with Harrison at the El Chico restaurant again on 2 different occasions, and both times, Harrison gave Harmon 2 1/4 ounces of cocaine. Now, it seemed like Teresa was both using and selling the drugs that she was getting from Harrison, and she'd kind of like paid her money that she owed him here and there, but her bill was getting quite high because, like I said, she's also using it, right? So she can't sell enough to make up for how much she's using. And in August of 1988, Dan Harmon told Harrison that he'd gotten in some trouble for writing bad checks, and he asked the drug dealer if he could borrow some money. The prosecuting attorney, who's like heading these grand juries and is this highly respectable figure, is not only picking up 8 balls of cocaine for his wife, but also borrowing money from drug dealers. And Harrison said he gave Dan Harmon $700, and then 2 weeks after that, he gave him $1,000, and then 2 weeks after that, he gave Dan Harmon another $1,000. And Harrison told the police that when he gave Dan Harmon that first $1,000, Dan Harmon gave him some information on how certain witnesses were testifying during the grand jury about Kevin and Don, and how their testimony had implicated Harrison. And also Harrison told the police that on many occasions he'd asked Dan Harmon to look into people that Harrison planned on doing business with, aka selling drugs to, and Dan Harmon did this for him. So it looks like Dan Harmon has developed this kind of personal relationship with this drug dealer at this point, where it's like, I know you're giving my wife a lot of cocaine. I know we can't pay for it all, but let me do other things for you. What other value can I offer you? How about I tell you who's snitching on you in the grand jury, right? And this is going to kind of tie back into, how did all of these people, these witnesses, end up missing or dead? Witnesses who knew things about the drug situation in Arkansas, witnesses who knew something about what had happened to Kevin Ives and Don Henry. How did they just start dropping dead and going missing? Well, that's because, in my opinion, allegedly, don't come for me. I mean, this is not just my opinion, it's shared by many people, but in my opinion, that's because people were calling into that tip line, which Richard Garrett was getting the information from that tip line and being like, oh, so-and-so knows this about this. Let's take them out. And then people were testifying, were being called, were being subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury. And Linda Ives and everyone else is like, what the hell did these people have anything to do with Kevin and Don? And Dan's like, it does, trust me. It didn't. Not really. I mean, it did. It all connects back. But in general, it seemed like Dan Harmon was using the grand jury as his way of getting people to talk, which would not only give him information against people that he could leverage and use against them, it would give him information that he could trade with drug dealers like Harrison, and it let him know what everyone else knew, so he would know who needed to be eliminated so that no one talked, and then implicated himself and Richard Garrett and others, not only in what had happened to Don Henry and Kevin Ives, but in this whole large-scale, intricate drug operation that Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett were apparently taking part in. Just my opinion, allegedly. Don't come for me, please. Okay, we have another woman. Her name was Cindy Boshears Tucker, and she would testify before the federal grand jury. So this wasn't the grand jury into Kevin and Don's deaths. This was the grand jury into the, corruption amongst public officials in Saline County and the drug trafficking happening in Saline County. She would testify before that federal grand jury on September 19th, 1989. And Cindy testified that she'd known Dan Harmon since she was 10. He had coached her softball team. And then she started working for him as a legal secretary from mid-1986 to December of 1987. And Cindy Boshears Tucker said that she'd stopped working for Harmon when her payroll checks were coming back for insufficient funds, but she also testified to having seen Dan Harmon using cocaine in his office on 2 occasions. The first time, she said, was in February or March of 1987 when she arrived to the office early one morning. She saw him, sniffing cocaine at his desk, as you do in the 80s when you're a lawyer, I guess. The next time was November of 1987 when she came back from lunch early and once again saw him doing lines at his desk. Now, Tucker had told her husband about this second incident, and he told her, maybe you should start looking for another job. Cindy Boshears Tucker also claimed that she'd seen Teresa Harmon using cocaine on 3 or 4 occasions at her home, and she was able to witness this because Cindy would often babysit for Teresa and Dan Harmon's young son, who at that point would have been like a baby. Cindy Tucker also talked about a lovely wedding present that Teresa Harmon had given her, because, it's the kind of thing you'd expect to get from your boss's wife, like maybe a cashmere sweater, or like a nice edible arrangement, not edibles like marijuana, like fruit, or, so just like a gift card to Starbucks, okay? So that was not the present that Teresa Harmon gave Cindy at all. Cindy talked about one day she came into the office, she was going to be getting married soon, and Teresa Harmon was on her way out. And Teresa told Cindy, hey, I left your wedding present on my husband Dan's desk. And so Cindy goes into Dan's office and she picks up this present, this wedding present from Dan's desk, and it was an 8-ball of cocaine, all neatly wrapped up in a paper bag. Very thoughtful, very considerate, very cutesy, very demure. Govar's memo said, quote, Miss Tucker acknowledged that it was pretty much a matter of common knowledge in Saline County that Teresa Harmon has sold drugs, but she also acknowledged that she had never been prosecuted in that county for drug sales, nor has she ever been arrested for it. I mean, is it because Teresa Harmon was married to Dan Harmon that she was never arrested or prosecuted for it? Because everybody knew. Govar goes on to say, quote, Ms. Tucker further acknowledged that Tammy Harmon, attorney Dan Harmon's daughter, has a reputation in the county for being a drug dealer, end quote. So we got Dan Harmon using drugs, talking to drug dealers, hanging out with them, making deals, wheeling and dealing with them. You got his wife who's using drugs and selling drugs. You got his daughter who's using drugs and selling drugs. And no surprise, because Teresa was friends with Tammy Harmon, and that's how Dan Harmon met her, which is creepy as fuck. Okay. Another witness, Scott Tracy Mattingly, told the state police that he'd known Teresa Harmon for 10 years, and over the course of that time, he'd purchased various types of narcotics and controlled substances from her. He said things like acid, cocaine, marijuana, opiates, I think, stuff like that. And during 1987, Scott Mattingly had bought drugs from Teresa twice, and he said that each deal had gone down at her home in front of Dan Harmon. Mattingly further testified that in February of 1988, Teresa had told him that Dan was getting nervous about her selling drugs because of his position in the community. Dude, it took Dan Harmon that long to get nervous about his wife being like this huge, well-known drug dealer while he's out there like prosecuting drug dealers? The hypocrisy. And anyways, that same month, while Teresa and Mattingly were talking about cocaine, Mattingly claims that Teresa said, quote, Danny only gets the good stuff, end quote. So it makes it seem, right, like that Dan Harmon is providing Teresa with the drugs to sell, which they are then both benefiting from monetarily. I mean, as long as Teresa's not putting most of their profits up her nose. After February of 1988, if Mattingly wanted to buy drugs from Teresa, he would have to arrange that through a third party, a woman named Kelly Green. He said he would have to go to Kelly Green's house. Kelly would then call Teresa, and then Teresa would bring over the stuff. The drugs. Another witness, Michael Bearden, was interviewed on August 3rd, 1989, and at that time, he was serving a sentence in prison for murdering his wife. Now, Bearden said that he was represented by Dan Harmon for that murder charge, and one night he got a call from his lawyer, Dan, saying they needed to discuss something, but they couldn't talk about it over the phone. Real, like, what is it called? Like, covert, cloak and knife, is that how they say it? He doesn't want him to talk about this over the phone, so Dan told Bearden to meet him at his office. Bearden goes to Dan Harmon's office, and there he was confronted with a proposition that if Michael Bearden bought the prosecuting attorney a Corvette, the murder case would be dismissed. And at that time, the prosecuting attorney was Joe Hardin. We're going to talk about Joe Hardin again, all right? Trust. So this is the person who's like on the other side of Dan Harmon in this. Dan Harmon is representing Michael Bearden, and Dan Harmon saying, listen, I talked to Joe Hardin, and he says if you buy him a Corvette, we'll just forget this ever happened. Look the other way, right? As Kathy Carty said, we'll just forget this ever happened. So they're on the different sides, opposite sides, technically and publicly, but it looks like behind the scenes, Dan Harmon and Joe Hardin were wheeling and dealing some more. Now, Bob Govar wrote in his memo, quote, Bearden told the investigators that there was a $65,000 life insurance policy on his wife and that Bearden was the beneficiary under the policy. According to information developed during Bearden's interview, the insurance company was not willing to pay off on the proceeds of the policy as long as the murder charge remained against Bearden. Obviously, like the insurance company is not going to pay out your wife's life insurance policy when you're charged with her murder. This seems to be pretty, straightforward and basic. But Bearden stated that he signed a contingency fee contract with Harmon, whereby Harmon would receive a percentage of the policy proceeds as his fee for representing Bearden on the murder case. According to Bearden, part of the insurance proceeds was also to be used to buy the Corvette for the prosecuting attorney so that the murder charges could be dismissed, end quote. So Dan Harmon's like, hey, we got lots of stuff going on here. You've got a murder charge. I don't really care whether you killed her or not. All I'm saying is you're going to get a big chunk of money from that life insurance policy. So if we can make a deal with Joe Hardin, you're going to take the life insurance money that you finally get once you're cleared of these murder charges, and you're going to give me a cut of it, and then you're going to buy him a Corvette. All right, let's go. Who cares about your dead wife who needs justice? We just want a Corvette. So we've got Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett implicated in some shady drug stuff. But you know who's not getting out squeaky clean? The illustrious Saline County Sheriff James Steed. Now, apparently, according to Bob Govar's memo, the IRS had assigned a special agent to do a background tax investigation into the former sheriff, and although Govar said he hadn't received a report yet, he stated, quote, "The initial investigation by Special Agent Percival will be to determine whether Sheriff Steed's lifestyle is consistent with his apparent income. In that same vein, we have received additional information concerning the former sheriff from Arkansas by State Trooper Jeff Ramsey," end quote. So Jeff Ramsey was a state trooper. He had previously worked as a deputy sheriff under James Steed, and he mentioned to law enforcement 2 incidents that Bob Govar felt needed some more looking into. Now, one of them involved a seizure of cash on a drug arrest in Saline County, and apparently the investigator who had brought the money in had previously counted it and determined that there was approximately $19,000 there. But James Steed, who was the sheriff at the time, told this investigator to sign a receipt indicating that he had delivered $3,000 to $4,000 less. The guy who brought the money in, the investigator, was like, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm all set on that shady ass shit." But still, Bob Govar, as well as everybody involved with this situation, thought it was still suspicious. And I believe that this stuff happens all the time in law enforcement, by the way. I don't want to say they all do it, but I think it happens quite a bit. Money gets seized from a drug bust, and then between the seizure and it being, clocked into evidence, some of that money goes away. Who knows what happens? No one knows how much was actually taken and how much ended up into evidence. What's the harm in skimming a little off the top? Ramsey talked about another time when he was at the sheriff's office on duty at night and he got a call from Richard Sampley. We've already talked about Richard Sampley. Richard Sampley told him that there was a large-scale gambling operation going down at a house in Lake Norrell in Saline County. And so Ramsey and Sampley went to the house, and Ramsey saw with his eyes, he visually saw the house lights were on, there were cars in the driveway, there was obviously activity and signs of life happening within the house. So Ramsey went back to the sheriff's office and he started making preparations to raid this house. But then one of the other deputies told Ramsey, "Hey, maybe you should call, our boss, Sheriff James Steed, before we go any further with this." And that dude's suspicious too, by the way. They don't give his name, but he's suspicious. I'd like to know what his name was. So James Steed was called and he was like, "Listen, I'm on my way to the sheriff's office. Do not do anything until I get there." And even though James Steed lived only a few blocks from the sheriff's office, a 5-minute drive, he didn't get to the sheriff's office until 40 minutes later. And when he did get there, he told the other investigators to just go home. And then he told Ramsey, "Listen, let's go to this house and I'll check it out with you. I'll show you there's nothing happening there." In the memo that Bob Govar wrote, he said, quote, "According to Trooper Ramsey, Sheriff Steed made statements which indicated to him that the sheriff did not think the gambling operation was any big deal. Trooper Ramsey stated that when he and the sheriff drove back to the location of the gambling operation previously shown to him by Richard Sampley, that the house was shut down, locked up, and the lights were out." Trooper Ramsey firmly believes that Sheriff Steed warned Mr. Peach, the operator of the gambling house, before they arrived. According to Sampley, Mr. Peach provided payments of $2,000 to State Prosecutor Joe Hardin, Circuit Judge John Cole, Sheriff James Steed, and Municipal Judge Pete Lancaster each Monday, end quote. Okay, we gotta unpack this. A lot happened. First of all, Ramsey firmly believes that James Steed gave the owner of this gambling house the heads up. Obviously. Why do you think it took him 40 minutes to get from his house to the sheriff's office? Secondly, Mr. Peach. Okay, it's gone from being a weird kind of unique soap opera to being a game of Clue. We've got Miss Scarlet, we've got Professor Plum, we got Mr. Peach. So, and then look whose names we have here. According to Sampley, Mr. Peach provided payments of $2,000 to State Prosecutor Joe Hardin, This is the same person who allegedly wanted Michael Bearden, who was charged with murdering his wife, to buy him a Corvette, and he would make the murder charge go away. Circuit Judge John Cole, who, I mean, I've already told you, I think that dude's shady AF. He's involved in everything. He's in every serious case, every serious grand jury that's happening, and he just doesn't seem to really be interested in getting to the bottom of things. Sheriff James Steed, who we already know is dirty and corrupt, allegedly, in my opinion, don't come for me. And then Municipal Judge Pete Lancaster. Where have we heard that name before? We heard that name when we were talking about the dude who got the heads up that the police were about to raid his marijuana farm, and he was like out there pulling up plants because he had gotten word that the police were coming, and he was trying to get his neighbors to help him. And what did Bob Govar say in that part of the memo? He said that he knew that the Friday before this guy's arrest, that Judge Pete Lancaster had been given the heads up because they had to get a warrant, and Judge Pete Lancaster would have had his eyes on that warrant and knew when the arrest was going to happen, and Judge Lancaster lived on land that was kind of right by this marijuana farm that apparently got raided, okay? So all of these people are dirty, all of them. You got judges, you got law enforcement, you got attorneys. This is horrendous, absolutely horrendous. It's almost as if it's made up. That's how horrendous it is. But this is, remember, in an actual government federal memo. This is evidence that the federal government has collected on these people. This is not a conspiracy theory. So on Monday, February 12th, 1990, Bob Govar also said he received a call from a woman, and this woman wanted to be anonymous. And the caller stated that someone named Donna Ramsey, who had once worked at a place called Landers Auto in Benton, had made statements that Sheriff James Steed routinely came in and picked up envelopes containing large sums of cash, so he's getting paid off from different places. And Govar wrote in the memo that the investigative goals in the case were to develop information on the cocaine, marijuana distribution activities of the organization headed by James Callaway, who his investigation showed was responsible for a large-scale cocaine distribution operation within Saline County. And Govar also said that there was a possibility that James Callaway may be involved directly or indirectly with the murders of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. So then on March 29th, 1990, Bob Govar sent Chuck Banks a follow-up memo in which he informed him they had interviewed other witnesses, including Tony Mullins, Finis Criswell, another funny name, Johnny Green, Teresa Sturch, and Amy Murphy. Now, Tony Mullins happened to be the half-brother of James Callaway, and he talked about the planning and the preparation of that crap game robbery. Now, Mullins' wife, Sherry, was actually able to back up his story because she'd been present at James Callaway's house on the night of the robbery. Mullins' story was as follows. He said that a week or two after the robbery, he overheard a call between James Callaway and Sylvania Peaks, who, remember, is the man who was running the crap game in Lonoke County and also is now a part of our game of Clue. Sylvania Peaks and Mr. Peach. So Peaks claimed that the sheriff of Lonoke County, who at that time was J.O. Isaacs had said he wasn't going to let any federal or state agency get involved in the matter, and he was going to keep things under wrap. He was going to keep it under control. And Sylvania Peaks said that the sheriff, who we just talked about, who's going to keep everything under control, he was getting a percentage of that crap game so that it wouldn't get raided. And Govar wrote in the memo that this might explain the sheriff's reluctance to hand over investigative files concerning that robbery, as well as the sheriff's constant complaining about the involvement of the Federal Drug Task Force in this robbery investigation. You think? You think, Bob Govar? I think that could explain it. Govar also talked about Finis Criswell, who was interviewed by law enforcement in February and March of 1990. And Criswell said that he had worked for James Callaway for a number of years. He'd recently been fired. However, he was aware that Callaway had planned a number of robberies involving trailers, which would be stolen, repainted, and sold at auction. Criswell had also heard Callaway talk on several occasions about selling cocaine to a lot of people, including Richard Garrett and Dan Harmon. And Govar wrote in his memo, quote, It should be noted that when Finis Creswell appeared in my office, he was virtually to the point of tears and appeared to have something on his mind which was really bothering him. When I asked Mr. Criswell why he was at the point of tears and why he was so visibly shaken, he stated that he was afraid of what would happen to him since he'd participated in the theft of a set of tires. In my opinion, and in the opinion of the investigators that were present, Finis Creswell was not demonstrating such an emotional reaction based on fear of what might happen to him resulting from the theft of a set of tires. In my opinion, Mr. Criswell knows a great deal more than he is telling, and that information will become apparent in the information below, end quote. He means the information that continues on in the memo. And basically what Bob Govar is saying is Finis Creswell wasn't worried about getting in trouble for stealing a set of tires. He was worried about getting in trouble with all the high up and powerful people involved in this. The sheriffs, the prosecuting attorneys, the law enforcement, the politicians, the actual dangerous drug dealers. He was worried that he was going to basically be killed and eliminated like many of these other witnesses because he was talking about what was going on in Saline County. Jerry Esom, who had been employed as an investigator in Saline County, was interviewed on March 5th in connection with this investigation. And he said that in 1985, he was a detective in charge of the Criminal Investigations Division for the Saline County Sheriff's Office. And at that time, James Callaway was operating his used car lot, and Esom was familiar with Callaway because he'd responded to a number of domestic dispute calls at Callaway's residence. But one time, Esom was actually called to the used car lot because Callaway claimed a car had been stolen from him by someone named Sonny Small, another funny name. And Callaway also told Esom that he had a problem. He said he'd been robbed at a gambling game in Lanoka County, and he wanted to know how much Jerry Esom would charge to break the legs of the people who had stolen from him. And so Jerry Esom played along, and he said, I can break the legs of 2 of these guys, but I'll probably have to kill the 3rd. He said, in fact, I might have to end up killing all 3. And James Callaway was like, you're speaking my language here, dude. I'm going to offer you $1,500 a piece to kill all 3. So not $1,500 for all 3, $1,500 times 3. And apparently these people that Callaway wanted Jerry Esom to kill were Richard Sampley, Danny Galt, and Michael Galt. Now, there was an actual legitimate reason that James Callaway wanted these 3 people taken out, but it wasn't because they robbed him at a gambling game. We'll talk more about that later. So Jerry Esom left the car lot. He went right back to the sheriff's office, to his boss, Sheriff James Steed, who's, keeps getting elected. He's the hero of Saline County at this point. And Esom's like, yo, dude, you would not believe what just fell into my lap. I want to launch an investigation concerning a conspiracy to commit murder against James Callaway. I want permission to go back to talk to Callaway wearing a wire so I can get his request for me to murder these people on tape. And Steed told him, no, absolutely not. Do nothing. Leave Callaway alone until you hear otherwise from me. And then you know what James Steed did? Nothing. He did nothing. He never brought it up again. Now, Jerry Esom, this investigator who worked under James Steed, he testified before the grand jury of Kevin and Don, and he tried to bring this up. But Dan Harmon cut him off and said the information he was giving was not relevant to these proceedings, even though in that 9 months there had been a ton of information given that was not relevant to these proceedings, but was relevant to Dan Harmon in figuring out who knew what about the drug operation and who knew what about Don and Kevin's deaths, so that Harmon himself could have knowledge about these people and then do what he wanted to do with that knowledge, if you know what I'm saying. I think you do. Jerry Esom also said that on March 2nd, 1990, he and 2 other police officers, Chief Deputy Sheriff Johnny L. Green and State Parole Officer Jim Lovett, spoke with Finis Creswell. And Creswell told them that after the deaths of Don and Kevin, he and James Callaway had been drinking together, and Callaway said that he had not intended these boys to die. It had not been intended to go that far. And then he kind of didn't talk about it anymore. Now, we also have 24-year-old Amy Murphy. She was interviewed by the police. She'd already been arrested for selling cocaine to an informant working for the Saline County Sheriff's Office. And she told the police that in the summer of 1989, she was heavily involved with drug dealing in Saline. She was selling cocaine, and she knew a woman named Sandra, whose son Russell Smith was getting cocaine from another man named Juan Ponce, who lived in Little Rock. Juan Ponce had been indicted in November of 1989 for distributing cocaine, and he was serving a sentence in the federal penitentiary. It was well documented, and Bob Govar knew that Juan Ponce had been operating in central Arkansas for 7 or 8 years, and that he was working along with 2 other individuals named Raymond Dominguez and Raymond's ex-wife, Patricia. And Raymond and Patricia had been making multiple trips to Miami to pick up cocaine, and then they would distribute it when they came back to Arkansas. And for a while, Russell Smith was selling cocaine for Juan Ponce, but then he started using the cocaine, and then he started coming up short with the money, kind of like Teresa Harmon, except, Russell doesn't have a powerful husband to do illegal things and cover his ass. But this caused Juan Ponce to send 2 people to beat up Russell or kill Russell. And this made Russell's mother, Sandra, sort of make a deal with Juan Ponce. And she said, listen, Mr. Ponce, I'll sell cocaine for you until my son's debt has been paid off. Now, Amy Murphy also said that during the summer of 1989, she was getting as much as 3 ounces of cocaine from Sandra, who's getting it from Juan Ponce. And Amy's best customer that summer was, surprise, surprise, Teresa Harmon. Govar wrote, quote, Amy Murphy told me that Teresa Harmon was hooked so bad on cocaine that she would come to Amy Murphy's house as many as 3 to 4 times a day to purchase cocaine, end quote. And apparently Teresa's habit had become so bad that she was purchasing $50 worth of cocaine at a time. So she's going to Amy's house like 2, 3, 4 times a day. She's spending $50 each time. And Amy was like, it didn't make any sense. This girl was strung out because she could have saved money by buying 1 8-ball all at once for $250. So we have a very financially responsible drug dealer in Amy Murphy here. I guess she could have told Teresa that, but she just kept selling her the cocaine for $50 a pop when she was showing up 2, 3, 4 times a day. Which is funny. Amy later, she's like, listen, I gotta save this woman some money, but she was just too hooked. Amy also claimed that she eventually stopped selling drugs to Teresa Harmon when Teresa began bringing her very young son to Amy's place to purchase this cocaine. Now, in May of 1990, right after Dan Harmon would be elected as the Democratic candidate for prosecuting attorney, a woman named Catherine Brightop testified in front of the federal grand jury. And she had a lot to say. So Catherine had dated 25-year-old Paul William Criswell for about a month. Paul had been charged with selling cocaine. He was also the son of Finis Criswell, who we've already heard from. Catherine testified that Don Henry and Kevin Ives had been killed because they had tried to steal drugs from James Callaway. She said that Paul had told her that Callaway and 3 other men had chased Don and Kevin and basically had killed them because they were trying to steal drugs from him. So we have 2 sort of similar but different stories. We have the story of Don and Kevin running into Dan Harmon and 4 other men on the tracks. They run off after a confrontation, and then 2 police officers bring Don and Kevin back to the tracks where they are then killed, and then their bodies are set up to look like an accident. And then we have the theory that James Callaway killed Don and Kevin because they were trying to steal drugs from him. Which one of these is true? Now, here's the thing. They both could be. And I know that's a complicated and a weird thing to say, but that is where we're going to pick up next time. And hopefully you guys are still here with me because I know this is long. I know there's a lot of information. And I didn't really know how deep it went, but I have to see it through now. I have to see it through, and I hope that you see it through with me. Thank you so much for being here. Hit the like button if you like this video. Share the video if you think it's worth sharing. Subscribe if you haven't already. We will be back very soon with part 4, and until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.